As we looked at history last time, we were trying to find some proof of God, or at least intelligent design, in the miraculous preservation of the Israelites. We talked about how chosenness has little to do with being better or more important than anyone else, but it's a selection with a purpose. One of the purposes that are given to us is is to understand and teach the unique and awesome revelatory power behind the Torah and the Hebrew language. All of the material here, unless otherwise noted, are from the books Living Judaism and Essential Judaism, these two books. When we talk about the writings of Judaism, of the Israelites, of course, the most important and primary writing is the Torah, the first 5 books of the Tanakh. Now, the Tanakh, which you'll often hear the Jewish Bible referred to, is an acronym of the three parts of the Bible. The first part, of course, being the Torah, the second part being the Navaim, the prophets, and the last third section being the Ketuvim, the writings, which includes pretty much everything else. And together they are known as the Tanakh. So first of all, let's take a look at the Torah, the instruction book, the written law. And we can see the Torah itself, and in its naming, contained within the word for Torah is the Hebrew word for light, plus the He, meaning it contains the light of God to the physical creation. So again, we see within Torah is the O and the R, the Bet and the Resh, and spelling light, or the word light. Okay? The word itself actually has an aleph to begin it. And then we have the He, which is, of course, the second letter, and the last letter, fourth letter of the Tetragrammaton. And the last letter, I believe it is the one that represents the physical aspect. So there we have the idea that contained within the Torah, the He meaning the light of God to the physical creation. So light to physical. Another interesting thought, again, this is something that as I was preparing this, that I thought about, is oftentimes the He is silent. You could also see the He replaced with an aleph to get the same pronunciation, Torah, which would give another interesting look at the meaning of Torah. Torah itself, of course, means instruction in the Hebrew. But if we had the aleph at the end, then you have the light, or of God's word, from the end, Tav, to the beginning, Aleph. The idea that instruction is coming from the end, which is the perfection, the final revelation, is contained also within the end is contained also within the beginning of the Aleph. We're here. At any rate, just another thought. But the Torah itself consists of 54 portions, divided between the 5 books. One portion is read each week throughout the year. The completion of the yearly Torah reading cycle and its new beginning takes place on the holiday of Simchat Torah, which literally means the rejoicing in the Torah, and that follows the last day of the festival of Sukkot in the fall. The continual process of reading Torah demonstrates the centrality of Torah in Jewish life, summarized into 3 words: creation, redemption, and revelation. The foundations of Judaism itself, not just the law, but also the life worth living, the ethical, relational, and spiritual aspects of the journey of the Jewish people to nationhood, the covenants with God, the failures, the consequences, the path to teshuva, repentance, and the love of God to always take us back. That is the most important eternal covenant and part of the message of the Torah. The power of the Hebrew language is given here. We can again see evidence of God in the mystical depths of every single letter. every single word, every single placement of words and letters that can be found in no other book. I'm only going to cover the highlights of the books here, just for the sake of time, but just the depth is incredible. And one more comment on the language itself, the Hebrew language, which is the primary language of the Torah, is the idea that there are 70 faces of the Torah, meaning that every single letter, every single word, every placement has 70 ways to understand it. The 70 just symbolic for an infinite number, or certainly a large number of ways to understand. The first book of the Bible, Genesis or Bereshit, as it's known, because the first word in the book is Bereshit, which means in a beginning, or when God began to create, another way that it's been translated. The first book of the Bible consists of 50 chapters containing 1,534 verses. We read in the synagogue today, and as it is divided into 12 parshiot or parshas, each parsha is divided into 7 different readings for each day of the week. Now, this will be true for all 54 parshas of the Torah. That's 7 divisions so that it can be read each day of the week and also studied in that way as well. I think the most important information I can give you at the mystical level of Genesis is the fact that this is not a history of the world. Very often there's criticism because it doesn't seem to be an accurate history. Well, it probably is more accurate than most people give it credit, but at the same time, the recognition is that that's not the purpose of the book of Torah, of the book of Genesis. It's not designed to be a complete history of the world. There's only one point God is making in the entire Torah, but especially in the first book, and it is establishing his choice and his right to choose a specific people to do a specific job. This is primarily the history and lineage of Abraham and his descendants, who will become the Israelites, who will become the Jews. The danger is that when someone tries to see this as a history of the world, there are all kinds of misunderstandings that can happen. So when we get into the next 4 books and we see the blessings and the curses for following or not following the commandments, someone who's not Jewish thinks this applies to them, and it doesn't. The idea of being grafted onto the vine that is so popular, especially in Christianity, that is Abraham and his descendants, is kind of like a German woman who marries an Italian man, claiming that she's now Italian. She may follow all of the customs of her Italian husband and family, but she's still German. If you want to argue that this grafting is miraculously done by God at some kind of cellular level, then I would say this is exactly what Judaism teaches with regards to converts. But the difference is that this is referring to someone who wholeheartedly accepts and follows both the written and oral laws. Most of the people that claim to be now the children of Abraham because they were grafted into it through their Messiah don't follow the Torah observantly. But that's not to say that Genesis doesn't concern itself with the rest of the world. One of the unique aspects of Genesis is that even though this is primarily a record of God's instructions specifically to the tribes of Israel, it's important to remember that much of this first book is a record of events and teachings for all of mankind. Up until the introduction of Abraham, we find this book as a very brief introduction to God's first covenant with all mankind following the flood. This is the Noahide covenant. Even with Abraham, we see his primary mission was to teach the world around him. This is well before the Sinai covenant. So what he was teaching was the Noahide laws. It's very likely that hidden within the brief encounter of Abraham with Melchizedek was the official passing of the role of priest and teacher from the Gentile world represented by Melchizedek, who was, according to the rabbis, was Shem, the son of Noah, to Abraham and his descendants. And Shem, of course, having been a priest by Jewish tradition, establishing the school of Shem, and his son Eber, who taught all of the patriarchs the teachings that God would have for them. So again, looking at Genesis, we see this process here going through, beginning with creation, the idea of paradise coming into creation and then being lost. We have the lineage of Adam to Noah. We have the angelic corruption leading to the flood, the first covenant, which would be the Noahide laws, and the Tower of Babel. And this is a very interesting story with relation to the Hebrew language. One of the understandings, rabbinic understandings of the story of the Tower of Babel is that just as this word is a word used in common vernacular to designate gibberish language, and so that's the mystical understanding behind the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, the crime, the sin, if you will, of the people at the tower was not so much building a tower, and that is allegorical probably as well, but it is in the fact that these were one people with one language, and the midrash, the story is, when they came to the valley of Shinar, they discovered a manuscript or some kind of document that had been hidden prior to the flood that contained the secrets of using the Hebrew language. This was the only language they knew, which was the Hebrew. This secret, as they began to develop it and understand it, would enable them great power of creation. And this was the concern that God had, not that God was afraid for himself, but that man would become so corrupted that there would be no chance of redemption. And that couldn't be allowed. So that's the reason for the division and the separation of the groups of people, and forced to disperse throughout the world, but with different languages. The question is often asked, what was the sin that they committed? Why was trying to storm the gates of heaven? Why would that sin require a disruption of their language? And the reason is because that was the sin that they committed. In God's justice, the punishment always fits the crime. So, if you will, the secret of the Hebrew language is something that is still hidden within the words of Torah itself. And it is something that won't be fully revealed until the Messiah returns. But that's the mystical understanding of the Tower of Babel. It had a lot to do with the use of the language of Hebrew, the use that Solomon himself actually came into the understanding of in the story of his building of the temple. Anyway, so that's an important story in the Torah that's often overlooked. We have Abraham called and tested, Abraham's descendants, the trials of Isaac and Jacob, Joseph enslaved and then elevated, and then the 12 sons becoming Israel in captivity. And that's the basic story in Genesis, which is the most comprehensive book in terms of what we might view as history, but the point is not so much as history, but as prophecy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that perhaps later on. The next book is Exodus, or Shemot, which means names. Again, most of the names of the books come from the first word in the book itself, but there's the significance of that is often much deeper than it seems. It's not just arbitrarily that's the first word, so that's what we're going to call the book. That name itself gives an idea of what the book is about and some of the deeper meanings of the book. So we'll see perhaps why names is an important aspect of the book of what we call Exodus. But again, in the Hebrew Bible, it would be known as Shemot. And we have the second book. Is the opening sentence that I talked about in the book is, "These are the names of," etc. So this book sets the stage for the giving of the Torah. It chronicles our sins and wanderings in the desert just before the entry into the Promised Land. The mystical importance of this book is that it is the prototype of the redemption to come. Just as I mentioned, Genesis was a prophecy, prophetic as to the world to come, and the world we're living in now, actually. So to Exodus. Just as Israel is delivered from Egypt, so will Israel be delivered from this final enslavement. Just as Moses was called to become Messiah, so too will the Messiah ben David be called. And we learn that just as Israel had to leave Egypt and move to the promised land, why couldn't God have chosen Israel in Egypt and then enable them, once all the 10 plagues had happened, enabled Israel just to take over the land of Egypt and become rulers there? But that wasn't the plan, and nor will it be the plan in the future as well. We're not to become world leaders. We are to be in our land, the promised land. So in the final redemption, all of Israel will be in their homeland. And just as Israel had to learn the lessons of the desert first, so too must we learn from our exile. So this book is also the point of departure from a focus on the world in general to the exclusive communication with Israel. But even here, we see the Erev Rav, those mixed multitude that followed Israel out of Egypt, demonstrating that even though there is a calling out from the world to be prepared for a special mission, that mission is still connected to the world. Israel is to become a nation of priests and kings, meaning that what Israel is chosen for is to become the spiritual leaders and examples and guides to the rest of the world. And we see that throughout the book of Genesis. We're given the understanding of the things to come as we get through Genesis. And of course, also very important in this book is the giving of the law. We see the 10 commandments, as they're called. Really, in the Hebrew, they're never called 10 commandments. They're called the 10 words or the 10 utterances. But the importance of obedience, the problems with disobedience, all of that we see here in the book of Exodus. Leviticus is the third book of the Bible, known in Hebrew as Vayikra, and he called, again for the opening lines, which you might be able to see here, Vayikra, and he called for its opening word. Here we find the bulk of the 613 commandments, the 613 mitzvot. In this book, Israel is given these instructions, primarily instructions for their development as priest and high priest. But mystically, they are a shadowing of the time when all of Israel will hold that title. And this is where the nation of priests is formed and taught. This is where we first see the prototype of the temple being built and prepared, and where we learn the requirements of observing the Shabbat and the blessings of generous giving. The title of the book, And He Called, gives us the answer to what calling is. What is that calling or chosenness, and what is it all about? So when we call ourselves the chosen people, and the question is, what are we chosen for? Well, this is where we find out. We find it out in the book of Vayikra, And He Called. Again, we see the details of the laws, learning obedience and trust, the building of the temple itself being, or the Mishkan, which is a prototype of the temple, itself being a very deep understanding of how we celebrate Shabbat, many other things. Very powerful teachings that come through all of this. But again, was for the time of those who are wandering in the desert, becoming Israel, but it's also for us today as we move into the end times and the times of Mashiach, when Israel will once again take her true place in the world. Numbers is the fourth book of the Bible, known in Hebrew as Bamidbar. Again, taken from the first words in the beginning of the book. But Bamidbar itself means in Midbar, in the wilderness. And that's dealing with, again, prophetically, our time in exile, which is our time in the wilderness. The significance, rebellion after rebellion, characterizes this book and this people. like a willful child that a parent must constantly scold, but also the parent loves because of the strength and potential that can be seen within that willfulness that will someday become obedience. But the consequence required to teach is the remainder in the wilderness and the loss of the promised land for that generation. So there's further trouble involving the Moabites and their king Balak, who unsuccessfully tries to send Balaam, a sorcerer, to curse the Hebrews, but instead gives us a beautiful prophecy of our future two redemptions. Interestingly, this is the only place in Torah where the Messiah is specifically mentioned. Every other time in the Torah, when the words Hamashiach is used, the words Messiah is used, it's referring to the high priest. Mystically, this book is the blueprint for our time in the wilderness, as the title tells us. This is where the tribes are designated and named, and where the Levites, the priestly clan, is established. This is also where we see the rebellions of Israel repeat themselves, and we wonder why God would put up with such a people. But if we look deeper, we begin to understand that we are only given a small glimpse of the 40 years, and I really had to see this. We don't know what happened during the entire 40 years. We only know a very small portion of that time, and during that portion there were rebellions, but it was only a small part of that time and of that people. We can learn from this, I think, that God is trying to show us not how awful Israel is, but how great his love is for his firstborn son. We learn that God so loved the world that he gave his firstborn son, Israel, to be the salvation for the world. They must take on the sufferings and bring Messiah to heal the world. This is what Balaam had to learn. It's what we must understand. Israel will always be protected by God, and what the world sees as its faults are simply a reflection of their own shortcomings. Still, they must pay a price. Israel must pay a price for those faults, and by their stripes, the world is healed. So again, we look at the Bamidbar, we see the tribal designations, the second year, the Levites established, all of the rebellions, the Moabites and Balak. Balaam can't curse Israel, but Balaam sees the future. Balaam, an interesting character. The rabbis teach that Balaam is considered the Moses for the Gentiles, and there are some ideas among the rabbis that Balaam was even a greater prophet than Moses. But um, but he allowed that prophecy to corrupt him, whereas Moses did not. But the Gentiles are, according to rabbinic understanding, the Gentiles also had their prophets who would lead and direct them as much as possible towards monotheism, towards God. So that's one of the understandings we get from Bamidbar, also known as Numbers. And the last book in the Torah, Deuteronomy, the fifth and final book, known in Hebrew as Devarim, the words, for the first important word in its Hebrew text, because it consists largely of Moses' repetition of the laws commanded by Adonai in the previous books. Its Greek name is Deuteronomion, which means the second law, or Deuteronomy, hence its common name. The book contains 34 chapters, 955 verses. It's divided into 11 parshas. The entire contents of Deuteronomy, but for the last few verses, details a farewell address to the Hebrew people by Moses. And this book is not just a retelling of what's gone before, but a cautionary tale to the next generation. Remember that this is who Moses is addressing at this point. The previous generation is gone. This is the new generation. It's also mystically a foreshadowing of what is to come for Israel in their last exile. But the culmination and promise for the future is to finally enter and take the land. That's where we're heading to here. But it is not Moses, and this I find very interesting. Again, allegorically, what does it mean? But it is not Moses the king or even Moses the Messiah who will take them into the land. It is Yahashua, which means it is God who saves them and leads them there. Again, the more deeper meaning is that it is God who leads and saves us. Even the Messiah is not God. The Messiah will enable us to have again, a connection to God, but it is God who will lead us and God who will guide us and direct us in all of the end times as we continue. And that's why Moses had to die, if you will, and Joshua or Yahashua is given that command then to continue the process. And that is the end of the Torah, the end of the 5 books of Moses. We believe that all 5 books were written by Moses. There's some controversy as to whether or not Moses wrote about his death and wrote after his death, but one understanding is that as a prophet, he knew what was to come. And so he was able to write about that. But at any rate, we believe all 5 books were written by Moses. And there's definite indications in the Torah itself that this is true. Now let's turn to the second section of the Tanakh. The biblical prophets in the name of God admonished the Jewish people for forgetting and forsaking God's commands. They called on the people to examine their lives and their conduct. They demanded social justice, honest, decent, righteous dealings between people, all people, not just Jews, but all people. And there was a very special concern and care that was commanded and given for the needy, for the poor, the hungry, the homeless, the widow, the orphan. They warned, the prophets warned of the dire consequences of God's punishment for those who ignore his demand for ethical lifestyle enhanced by ritual observance. They called on the people to repent their ways before it was too late, and they always held out the promise of God's forgiveness for the individuals and for the whole Jewish people who mend their ways, seek God's forgiveness, and return to observing God's command. Very important to recognize as we look at all of the prophets, that crucial understanding that every single one not only prophesied for their own time, and certainly it was for their own time, but there was some element of looking to the future, as with all of Tanakh, all of Torah, and the rest of the Hebrew Bible. The point and purpose of it is to help us to get through this final exile and reach the end times when Messiah would be here, when the Son of David would continue the rule and the reign, not of the world, but of Israel. And through Israel, as teachers, as priests, through Israel then to reach the rest of the world. That's the point. But the other thing, as I mentioned earlier on, the other main point to keep looking at over and over again is this idea of we are responsible for one another. When we get to the section on beliefs, we'll talk about the Great Commandment. And many Christians believe that this was a quote from Jesus. It wasn't. It was a quote from Rabbi Hillel that most likely Jesus was repeating. And that is the idea that the greatest commandments are to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And the idea there is that we are responsible for one another. We cannot ignore our social responsibilities in this world to all people, Jews and Gentiles. So that's the message we'll see over and over again in the prophets as we take a look at them. So the early prophets, these 4 considered the early prophetic works. The book of Joshua, the first one, describes the conquest of Canaan, the division of the land among the 12 tribes, and the beginning of Jewish life in the Promised Land. The next book, the book of Judges, Shoftim, it records the history of the tribes during a period of civil rule under the judges. This was a time before kings. It was a time when Israel was ruled not by any one person, but by someone that God would raise up in time of need. When there was not a time of need, then essentially the tribes are ruling themselves during this period. So the judges' primary function appears to have been military leadership, although Deborah, Eli, and Samuel are also called prophets. The third book then is the book of Samuel. There are 2 books of Samuel, the first and the second. These books describe the life of Samuel, who anoints Saul as the first king of Israel. They continue by describing the anointing of David as Saul's successor and the rule of King David. Samuel is considered the last of the judges and the first of the prophets, so that he's the link between judges and kings, the connection between the two, and therefore in this position as the third book of the early prophets, Samuel holds that distinction. A lot of teachings, a lot of understandings about who Shemuel was, and what his role still is today in teaching us. But again, that's the book, very important third book in the early prophets. And the fourth book is Melachim, Kings, the book of Kings. There are two books, Aleph and Bet, or 1 and 2. These books describe the end of David's rule, the anointing of King Solomon, the budding of the building rather of the Holy Temple. The books conclude with the destruction of the Holy Temple, the first destruction, and the exile of the people from the land, as the 10 tribes of the north are taken by Assyria, leaving Judah for another 100 years before they are taken by Babylon in the Babylonian captivity. And that is essentially the end of the Babylonian captivity, is the end of the chronological time period of the entire Tanakh. The next sequence, the book of Maccabees, which is extra biblical, deals with the times beyond that. But at any rate, we have then the fourth book of the prophets, the book of Kings. The next section would deal with the latter prophets, the prophets then after the time of Samuel, but also during the time of the kings. The latter prophets lived between the 8th and the 5th centuries. Again, that 5th century is when that final exile will take place. But these are divided into two sections, the major prophets and the minor prophets. Now, to be clear, the designation of major and minor have no distinction in terms of these prophets are more important than any of the other prophets. The distinction of major and minor has to do with the volume of writing that that exists today. So here we actually begin the Tanakh division that is known as Nevi'im, the prophets. So the three major prophets are Yeshayahu, or Isaiah. Isaiah has a book of 66 chapters. One important thing to understand about Isaiah, very important to know. He was the primary prophet at the time before and during Hezekiah's reign, King Hezekiah. And that every single, please hear this, every single messianic prophecy that is used today to describe a certain Messiah was given by Isaiah first and fulfilled, every single one, in his time by King Hezekiah. Okay, it doesn't mean that there aren't future prophecies involved here, but every future prophecy had its basis in what King Hezekiah did and fulfilled. And that's very important to recognize as you pull verses out of Isaiah to prove one thing or another. You have to recognize the context of the entire book of Isaiah, which was a prophecy and an understanding that Hezekiah was to be the Messiah. That was the hope. Didn't happen, but that was the major hope here. So again, when you read Isaiah, recognize that these prophecies were indeed fulfilled by the son of David, by King Hezekiah, who was the first after his ancestor David who could claim the title of Messiah. But sadly, Israel was not yet ready, and that has been the sad truth until today. We're told that there is a Messiah in every generation ready to take that position if Israel is ready. But ultimately, there is a final date when the Messiah will come, whether we are ready or not. And if you listen to my class on the Messiah, you'll hear more about that. The next prophet we'll look at is Jeremiah or Yirmiyahu. The book of the prophet Jeremiah foretells and witnesses the destruction of the Holy Temple, the land of Israel, and the exile of the people. So it's going to be after Hezekiah. After Hezekiah, but after Isaiah, and then Jeremiah. It teaches God's demand for ethics and human morality. And these prophets did overlap each other. We'll talk more about the overall look of prophets when we get to the minor prophets. But it teaches God's demand for ethics and human morality. It contains deeply moving lamentations. And of course, Jeremiah also wrote the book Lamentations over the fate of the Jewish people and offers consolation and hope in exile. Jeremiah called the weeping prophet, as this portrait shows. And it's very poignant to read Jeremiah and recognize how he must have agonized over the fact that people weren't listening to him. But he had such a great love of his people, as God did, that it caused him a great deal of pain and sorrow. And his life and the ending of his life, the whole history of Jeremiah. It's a beautiful book, just a powerful book. At any rate, as are they all. The next book that we'll look at is Ezekiel, Yechezkel. This is the book of the prophet Ezekiel, contains prophecies in the Babylonian exile now. We are in, Ezekiel is in the exile. It's filled with lamentations as well over the transgressions of the people, the destruction of Jerusalem. It offers consolation and injunctions for the future. Ezekiel is a visionary prophet telling of the visions of God and the restoration of the land and the people. The book emphasizes the importance of the temple, the priests, and the sacrificial worship and their renewed centrality when the people are restored to the land. He had his vision of the chariot of God, which is probably the one part of the book that almost everyone is at least vaguely familiar with from Ezekiel. But Ezekiel also had, and probably more importantly, a detailed vision of the third temple that will be, in many commentaries would speak of this, that this is the blueprint that will be used to build the third temple. But many rabbinic commentaries believe it can only be built by Messiah, even though there are those who believe today that it could be built before the Messiah comes. But time will tell. But that's the book of Ezekiel, and those are the three prophets that are considered the three major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel in those books. The 12 minor prophets, and again, as I mentioned, they're called minor prophets only because we have fewer writings from them. It's not a statement of their value. Remember that during the time of the prophets, and if you don't know this, it will be a surprise to you perhaps, but there were thousands of legitimate prophets who all spoke what God gave them to speak. There was a school. There was actually a school of prophets, which existed at that time. It may have been started by Eli from the time of Judges, or it may date even further back from the school that we know from rabbinic literature was started by Shem, the son of Noach, which was attended by all of the patriarchs and their children. This may be an offshoot or a carrying on of the school of Shem, so much, much older. But at any rate, there was a school that we read about in the scriptures that existed for prophets at this time. And the very interesting story of Samuel and Eli, and Samuel receiving a message from God, but he didn't know what it was. He heard his name several times, and he finally went to Eli and said, "What's this about?" Eli said, "The next time you hear that, say, 'Here I am.'" And that's how the prophecies of Samuel began. Excuse me. So that school was a training ground for the prophets. The first book we'll look at in the 12 minors is the book of Hosea. This book of the prophet Hosea teaches that ritual worship is meaningless unless it is accompanied by ethical lifestyle. And all of the times, I've heard this so many times that especially non-Jews that will say, and even Jews as well, who will say, well, look, the prophets over and over again say the temple was meaningless. That's not what they said. They never said that. They would never say that. And the fact that the temple will exist in the future, in the Messianic age, tells us that to God, the temple was never and will never be useless. The sacrifices had a very important purpose. But what was said over and over again is that the sacrifices, when they became simply an acting out from an obligation rather than from the heart, they became useless to the people and therefore useless to God. So Hosea combines opposition to the monarchy, pessimism about the future of the Jewish people, with stirring passages of consolation. Probably for those who have read Hosea, especially Gentiles and others who may not be as familiar with the deeper meanings behind it, are very shocked in Hosea, because it is Hosea that is ordered by God, commanded by God to marry a prostitute. And indeed, there's a very deep, very powerful, very loving meaning behind all of that. And there will be a happy ending. I'll give you a spoiler alert there. There will be a happy ending in the book of Hosea. All right, the second book we'll talk about is the book of Joel, or Yoel. I remember there's no J in Hebrew, so it's Yoel. The book of the prophet Joel urges the people to repent their errant ways. It reminds the enemies of Israel that they will one day be punished for their opposition to the Jewish nation. The third book is the book of Amos. The book of the prophet teaches the need for kindness and compassion among people and between nations. It has particular resonance for those concerned with social action as a component of Jewish practice. And Amos is a great humanist, proclaiming a God who will not countenance the exploitation of the poor and the oppressed, a message which sadly needs to be delivered in today's time over and over and over again. The next book is the book of Obadiah, or Obadiah. The book of the prophet Obadiah prophesies the downfall of the nation of Edom. And Obadiah, it was most likely, or certainly was, a convert. Um, and that is why his focus, he was a convert from Edom, from Edom. And therefore he was, if you will, the prophet to Edom. And that's why his prophecies are primarily concerned with Edom and the downfall of the nation. There's also some interesting prophecies which could very easily be related to today's times, as he talks about the downfall of Edom. The fifth book, the book of Jonah, another book that is mostly familiar to so many people, or Yonah, as he would be called in Hebrew. And here we have a reluctant prophet, and this teaches us about the incredible power of repentance. But why was he reluctant? He was reluctant because he was being sent to not Jews, not to the Israelite nation. They wouldn't be known as Jews yet, but not to Israelites. But he was sent to the pagans, to the Assyrians. Remember, at this time, the Assyrians had already transported the 10 tribes out. They were a great enemy of Israel. And Jonah was very afraid, not for himself and not because he didn't believe God, but because he knew God. He knew that if he went to the Assyrians with God's power, that they would very likely repent. And he didn't want that because that would mean that God wouldn't punish them. So what we learn from the message of Jonah is not so much about Jonah, but about God and God's love for all of his children, not just Israel, but for even the enemies of Israel, that God does not desire the death of the wicked, but he desires them to repent and turn from their wicked ways. And that's exactly what happened in Assyria. Many other interesting things about the book of Jonah. There's a verse in the Christian scriptures that Yeshua, Jesus, talking about the end times, says, "As it was in the days of Jonah, so it will be in the end times." And that So that book becomes very important. But you really, in order to understand that, you have to look beyond the book itself, and do some checking, do some historical sleuthing, and find out what happened in the world during this time. And you'll find that there were plagues, earthquakes, there was a solar eclipse. So many things that we could possibly turn to today and see that we are living in the days of Jonah. At any rate, so interesting things. Fifth book, the book of Jonah. The sixth book here, we're looking at the book of Micah, or Micha. And Micha is the prophet who prophesies about the destruction of Jerusalem because of its corrupt leaders, spells out God's requirement for humankind. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God, Micah 6:8. The requirement of what it takes to do what God wants us to do. When we look at beliefs, we'll probably take a look at this verse again, because it's one of the verses that's considered a breakdown of the 613 commandments. This is considered the three. It breaks down in several different ways, but this is three of commandments that are considered primary to God: to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. And if we think about what this means, and we think about the message over and over again of the prophets to care for one another, to be socially responsible, that's what this is saying is very important to God. Okay, so those are 6 of the 12 minor prophets. Continuing our look at the minor prophets, the seventh in the order, we have the book of Nahum. The book of the prophet Nahum prophesies, essentially, its purpose is to prophesy the downfall of Assyria. And if we consider the location of Assyria around Iraq and Iran today, we can see very interesting prophecies, again related to our own times as well. But as with all prophets, these prophecies were given for their own times. But that doesn't mean we can't look at future predictions involved in it. The next book is the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, is the book of the prophet Habakkuk that asks the question, why do the innocent suffer and the wicked prosper? Why do bad things happen to good people? He was the first one to ask that question, and replies that God's answer is that the fall of the wicked will come. So the answer, I suppose, there is that what we will find out at the end of all of this, during the time of the Messiah, we will, beyond a shadow of a doubt, recognize that in everything that has happened to you, to me, to the world, where we think there's so much injustice, we'll find out that there was not, that God was present in all of these situations, and there was a purpose and a reason behind it. So that's the message, if you will, of Habakkuk. The next book, the ninth, Zephaniah, or Zephaniah, is the book that prophesies the destruction of the wicked and the destruction of the land, and foretells the redemption of the remnant of the Jewish people in an era of harmony and peace. So again, we have the ending is good, and it's all good in the end. And if it's not all good, then it's not the end. Is the message for Zephaniah. The 10th book, Haggai. Haggai reprimands the people for living comfortably in exile. I wonder if we could apply that today. A warning that we should definitely take to heart today. So the book of Haggai, if we read it, we will see definitely a message to ourselves, but a message to those living in Haggai's time. And so one of the interesting things to point out in that comment, and we've talked about this in terms of the history class, but the idea that when Israel left Egypt, the rabbis tell us that only 20% of the Israelites left Egypt. 80% stayed behind. Why? Because they were comfortable there. The same thing happened in Babylon. When the tribe of Yehuda was taken in captivity to Babylon 70 years later, returned to Israel, only 20% returned. 80% stayed behind. Why? Because they were comfortable. And there were good things that came out of that, that having that people there. But for the most part, it is not what God wants. And the same thing is happening today. And there are other reasons why someone might not move to the land of Israel, and I understand that. But essentially, we are commanded to live in Israel. That is our home. And yet so many people don't go because, well, it's uncomfortable. I have a great life here in the United States of Babylon. Why would I want to leave? So that's the message that we get from Haggai, that be careful about that excuse that I'm comfortable in exile. We will never be comfortable in exile. And one of the things that we should learn from history is that when we do feel comfortable, the Jews in Germany prior to Hitler felt very comfortable in Germany. They wanted to make it their homeland. And then God gave them a reason not to be comfortable there. So we may be careful that that doesn't repeat itself today. The 11th book then is the book of Zechariah. The book uplifts the spirits of the disheartened with prophecies of victories over their enemies. Very much a future looking book. Deals with the future redemptions, the visions of the restoration and rebuilding of Israel. A very powerful book to read, to find hope as we live in this time of exile. And finally, the last book, the book of Malachi. It's the book of the prophet known as Malachi. It contains admonishments for neglect of the ritual and ethical laws by the people, and particularly by the priests. It prophesies the coming of the Messianic era, the days of judgment and ultimate peace and harmony. It's the book in Malachi that speaks of the coming of Eliyahu as a forerunner to the Messiah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the sons and the sons to the fathers. Again, another very forward-looking book dealing with our times today, as well as the times that he lived in. So let's look at the 12 minor prophets. So now we look to the third section of the Tanakh. This is the Ketuvim, or the writings, the book of writings. And we see here Ketuvim contains the wisdom literature, the poetry, songs, narrative, history, religious philosophy, and love hymns. It consists of 12 books, 3 praise and wisdom, 5 scrolls read during specific holidays, and 4 of the books historical. Probably the 3 major books in the book of writings we'll take a look at here. Tehillim, or Psalms. The book of Psalms is a collection of 150 prayers, many attributed to the authorship of King David. This book is without a doubt the most known and read portion of Tanakh for the world, especially outside of Jewry, but also for Jews. Whenever we are in a time of distress, whether physically or spiritually, there's a psalm for that. Before there was an app for that, there was a psalm for that. So according to Chabad, quote, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe once said that if we only knew the power of psalms and its effects and the effects of its recitation, we would recite them constantly, unquote. Know that the chapters continuing, he would say, Know that the chapters of Psalms shatter all barriers. They ascend higher and still higher with no interference. They prostrate themselves in supplication before the Master of all worlds, and they affect and accomplish with kindness and compassion, unquote. Psalms is structured to be read every 7 days or every 30 days and make up the majority of the prayers chanted every day in Judaism. They were the primary sources for the music in the temple, and it's taught that when David composed most of the Psalms, he knew that he was writing them not only for himself, but for future generations. Many Psalms are composed as acrostics, which means they use the letters of the Hebrew alphabet to begin each line. A very powerful book. There are sources that you can Google, get online to find out. Every single psalm has a particular purpose or use for times of need and troubles. And it's not a bad idea to have a list of that handy so that you can always know which psalm to turn to. Certainly for healing, psalms have been used for centuries to provide healing. The second book is the book of Proverbs. It contains short statements that teach a value or give advice about how to live. And the third book in this first section of the Ketuvim is the book of Eov, or Job. The book of Job tells the story of a man confronted by great suffering, how he responds with faith. It's a sublime essay on the meaning of good and evil. Again, from the rabbis, very interesting history. Eov, or Job, was supposed to have been, along with Balaam, one of the three advisors. Jethro was the third, Moses' father-in-law. Three advisors to Pharaoh during the time of the Exodus, during the time of the plagues. And the three of the three, Jethro is the one that counseled Pharaoh to give in, to recognize the God of Israel, and for that he was essentially excommunicated. Balaam told him to hold out, that there was no way that he should give in, and Eov took the middle ground and said, well, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. And it is for that, again, this is midrashic, this isn't from the Tanak, but it's for that he was punished, or allowed to be punished in that context. So again, that's just another look at it. But the book of Job, a very important book to understand that we aren't always punished for our sins. That sometimes there's just something going on that we have no clue about, but that always God chastises us for our growth and our becoming more like Him. So that's the book of Job. The next section in the Ketuvim, the book of writings, are the 5 scrolls, so called again because they are often contained in their own separate scrolls and read at various times during different festivals. So the first one, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, is a symbolic metaphor for the love between God and the Jewish people. It's read on Passover. There was some debate at one point as to whether or not Song of Songs should be allowed as one of the main books in the Tanak. And it was argued that even though its erotic and sensual nature is sometimes disturbing, it is all a reflection of God's love for His people Israel. And upon that, it was accepted as part of the initial canon of the Jewish Bible. The second book, the book of Ruth, is a testament of faith, a commitment to God and Torah. It's read on Shavuot. Ruth, of course, becomes the most famous of the early converts to the Hebrew faith, and her descendants, one of the first, I should say, Jethro probably is the first that we can think of. But anyway, she becomes a very important early convert to the Hebrew faith. Her descendants will, of course, include King David. And interesting teachings as to why we have so many converts in Judaism that play such a crucial role in our future and in the coming of the Messiah. So we won't deal with that here. We talk about that a little bit in the Messiah class. The third scroll is the scroll of Lamentations. This scroll bemoans the destruction of Jerusalem. It holds out hope for the restoration and return through repentance. It's read on Tish B'Av, and of course its book Lamentations, or Eicha, was written by Jeremiah. So get that very sad but also hopeful at times book to be read. The fourth scroll is Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, another book that most people are familiar with. They may not really have read it, but they're familiar with its existence and some of the quotes. Of course, the ideas from it. The book itself is rather pessimistic. Sometimes it's considered cynical. And the essay is on the meaning and existence and of the need for a plan for living with highest purposes. So vanity, vanity, all is vanity. The idea that that there's, why would we live? Why do we struggle the way we struggle? But the ultimate goal, the ultimate understanding in Ecclesiastes is that there is a purpose and there is a plan. So again, Kohelet is its Hebrew name. We call it Ecclesiastes. It's read in the synagogue on Sukkot, a very important time for Gentiles, actually. And we'll talk about that in the book, in the class on festivals, a little bit about it. The last scroll is the scroll of Esther. The book of Esther tells the story of loyalty to God, the strength of the Jewish people in the face of an oppressive tyrant. Esther, of course, is read in the synagogues on Purim, on the festival of Purim. Esther, another one of those books that almost didn't make it because there's no mention of God in the book, and so the rabbi said, well, that can't be important, until it was finally pointed out that God, just as the name means hidden, God is hidden throughout the work. And so it became the fifth scroll in the Tanakh. And the last section of the Ketuvim are the four historical books. And the first book that we're talking about here is the book of Daniel. It emphasizes that God is the ruler of all, that his power will prevail. It also contains the first biblical reference to the idea of the resurrection of the dead at the coming of the Messianic age. Daniel is a prophet, but the reason that he is, or Daniel as the Hebrew would be, but Daniel is the question of Daniel's ability to be a prophet, and the reason he wasn't included in the book of prophets is that Judaism teaches very clearly that there are no prophets outside of the nation of Israel. There's the spirit of prophecy. Prophecy still exists, but one cannot call themselves a prophet if they are not in the land of Israel. Daniel lived almost all of his life in exile, and even though he lived during the time of the return, he also didn't return to Israel, but because of his age and infirmities at the time. But at any rate, Daniel is definitely has many great prophecies within it. We know, of course, the prophecy of the beasts and of the statue. So all of that is from the book of Daniel. Ezra records the return of the Jews from captivity in Babylon, the plans for the restoration and rebuilding of the Holy Temple, followed by Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah records the rebuilding of the Holy Temple, the reestablishment of religious sacrificial practices, It records the institution of religious reforms and the enforcement of the laws of the Sabbath. The later history books tell an important story. The Judeans were the only people in human history known to have been taken into captivity as an entire nation, and yet to have survived with their religious and social identity intact. What kept them alive? Ironically, the Judeans apparently thrived during the Babylonian exile. When they were allowed to return to Judah, only 10 or 20% did so. The remainder were comfortable enough in Babylon to stay there. So again, many messages that we can pull today from what took place here in that time. And the final book is the two books actually, the Book of Chronicles, or Divrei Chayamim. There are two books of Chronicles. The books of Chronicles are both a complete review of Jewish history from the creation of the world and humankind until the return to the land of Israel and rebuilding of the Holy Temple, paralleling the historical segments of Torah and the books of Samuel, and particularly the books of Kings. So that's a look at the Torah, the Tanakh, and all of the books, and we'll close this out with that information and continue on. Now, I do want to say this is going to be a long video, but it is a video, so this would be a good stopping place, and then you can come back. The second half, we're going to take a look at the other writings of Judaism. Just before we talk about the other writings, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about how to study not only Torah and Tanakh, but really anything coming from rabbinic or any other spiritual sources. It's a form of study called the Pardes, or the garden. The preface for the four methods to study the Bible that's involved in the Pardes is a story told in the Babylonian Talmud about four rabbis from the first century who entered the Pardes, or garden, which is symbolizing sort of the abode of God. The story goes, the rabbis taught four entered the Pardes. They were Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to them, "When you come to the place of pure marble stones, do not say, 'Water, water,' for it is said, 'He who speaks untruth shall not stand before my eyes.'" Ben Azai gazed and died. Regarding him, the verse states, "Precious in the eyes of God is the death of his pious ones." Ben Zoma gazed and was harmed, also translated, went mad. Regarding him, the verse states, "Did you find honey? Eat only as much as you need, lest you be overfilled and vomited." Acher cut down the plantings. Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and left in peace. Rashi says that Ben Azai died from looking at the divine presence. Ben Zoma's harm was in losing his sanity. Acher's cutting down the plantings in the orchard refers to becoming a heretic from the experience. Acher means the other one, and we aren't given his actual name in this story. Now, Rashi explains this section of Talmud by saying that the four rabbis ascended to heaven by utilizing the divine name. Whether it was in the flesh or not, we're not really told or sure, but it might be understood as achieving a spiritual elevation through Jewish meditation practices. The basic understanding of the purpose of the story is a warning about anyone delving into the mystical concepts of Torah without a firm foundation in the basics, with the understanding that it is through the Torah that that we can enter the garden. The rabbis used the four letters of the Hebrew word for garden, Pardes, to form the four methods of studying. The four letters that make up the word for garden are the Pei, the Resh, the Dalet, and the Samek. These become Peshat, which is the surface level understanding, straight or literal, direct meaning. Remez, which is hints. It's the deeper allegoric, hidden, or symbolic meaning beyond just the literal sense, just below or above the surface, depending on how you're looking at it. In the version of the Zohar Re'ah, it talks about that a little bit. And then the third is Drash, from the Hebrew darash, which means to inquire or to seek. The comparative midrashic meaning is given through similar occurrences. Drash, also what is referred to as a rabbi's sermon, is called the drash, and that's the kind of the meaning behind that. Sod then is where the warning comes in. Sod is the secret, mystery, or the esoteric mystical meaning as given through inspiration or revelation. Although these methods can overlap, the caution is that a student must be thoroughly grounded in the Peshat level before proceeding to study at the next level, and so on. These same levels of study can apply not only to the entire verse, but to each word and to each letter of each word. Thus, the rabbis also teach that there are 70 faces to the Torah, meaning that there is an infinite number of ways, or at least a large number of ways, to study and understand God's word. So that's the Pardes, the garden, and the idea in studying any of the mystical texts. And this is why the Kabbalah, and we'll talk about this when we get to that section, has been forbidden for many to study because there is the danger of, first of all, of just being so confused that it either drives you insane or it drives you away from the faith. And of course, death also a concern as well. So again, we'll talk about that. But that's one method of studying Torah, and that is the Pardes, or the garden level: Peshat, Remez, Darash, and Sod. We talked about the written law, which is the foundation of all laws governing Jewish life. This is from the Torah is considered the written law, and really all of Tanakh could be considered the same way. But the written law is something that has one main foundational support in Judaism, but there's a second group of writings that deal with the law, and it's called the oral law. There are many laws given in the written Torah without much of an explanation. And it's understood by all Torah observant Jews that these explanations were also given at Sinai, but were not to be written down because of the importance of a teacher-student relation to learn them with proper understanding. Again, very similar to what we learned in terms of studying at the deeper levels of Torah, the danger of entering the garden, if you will, without a foundation. So it's the same idea. The oral law was something that was supposed to be delivered orally by your teacher, so that there could also be explanations and understandings that you might not get just by reading it. But at some point, it was determined that these oral laws needed to be organized and eventually, with reluctance, written down. Because of the exile, because there was a fear that the oral law would be lost, that no one would be there to teach it. So this happened over several hundred years, involving thousands of rabbinic scholars and 5 major works involved in that, which we'll be talking about now. The first compilation of the oral law, the laws and ideas that are in the Mishnah, were compiled over a period of approximately 400 years, from 200 before the Common Era until 200 in the Common Era, at the beginning of the 3rd century. The various laws were put together in one collection by the editor, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince. He was the last leader of the Sanhedrin, of the last Sanhedrin, and also a descendant of King David, hence the title Judah the Prince. The Mishnah, which collects all the Jewish legal material from the post-Torah era, is divided into 6 orders or major chapters, each of which is subdivided into tractates or books. There are 63 separate tractates in the Mishnah. The 6 orders are the Zeraim, seeds, and that deals with agriculture and tithing in the land of Israel during the time of the Holy Temple. There are 11 tractates in that, so we see that here. Again, the Mishnah put together, and these are the 6 tractates or chapters. The next one, the second chapter, is Moed, or the festivals or times. It deals with the laws of observing the Sabbath and the festivals. There are 12 tractates in that book. The third is Nashim, or women. It deals primarily with the laws of betrothal, marriage, and divorce. 7 tractates in that. The fourth one is Netzakim, which is damages. It deals with civil and criminal laws. And then the fifth is Kedoshim, the holy things, deals with rules of bringing sacrifices to the holy temple, 11 tractates there. And then the sixth order of the Mishnah is Taharot, purification. It deals with the laws of ritual purity and impurity with 12 tractates. The rabbinic sages who are quoted in the Mishnah are called the Tanaim, or the teachers. So we have, again, the first in the oral law section being the Mishnah. And you can see here on this timeline, there's the Tanaim, and then the next group we'll talk about is the Amoraim. All right, and that was all after the Sanhedrin, the last Sanhedrin, which was the high court of legislators, and that ended in 359 of the Common Era. So the next section, the next commentary, if you will, on the Talmud is called the Gemara. Now, the Gemara was essentially a commentary by those that followed the Tanaim and gave their views on what was said in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, again, is the basic Talmud. It's the basic discussion of all of the 613 laws. And then commenting on that is the next section, the Gemara. It's a compilation of the discussions, interpretations, explanations, and theological arguments about the Mishnah. In the 400-year period from the final editing of the Mishnah in 200 of the Common Era until about 600 of the Common Era, new situations arose that the Mishnah hadn't addressed, and in response, the rabbinic sages of that time articulated the new interpretations and new laws. So the rabbinic sages who are quoted in the Gemara are called the Amoraim, which means the interpreters. The Gemara in Israel was developed until approximately 350 of the Common Era to 400, and was compiled into a final form by about 500. So again, looking at the timeline here, we have the Tanaim, who wrote the basic part of the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Amoraim, and then they wrote the following, the Gemara, following section. So the combined Mishnah and Gemara is called the Talmud together, and it's studied for the practical applications of its laws, for its mind-expanding challenges in logic and reasoning, and for its total immersion in Jewish concerns, its wisdom and insights into the human experience, and for its own sake, for the simple love of learning and growing. The difficulty with the Talmud, as we'll see in just a minute, is the density of it. And it would be akin to you and I, without any legal training, trying to read a legal textbook or a legal law book, which would be filled with examples of court cases and the views that were expressed, and the positive view, the negative view, back and forth discussions, all of that. Mix in with that, and this is the difference of the Talmud, mix in with that various religious or spiritual stories, some that seem mythical, certainly allegorical, and you get a very confusing text to read without help, without teachers. So even though this is called the oral law and it is written down, it's still basically taught orally. It's taught in the yeshivas, and study of it is much easier when you're with a group of people, with a study partner and a rabbi and teachers to guide and direct you. So the next writing that I want to talk about is the Shulchan Aruch, because it is related to the oral law, the Talmud. And the Shulchan Aruch, it literally means prepared table. It is a compilation of Jewish law written by Joseph Caro around 1567 in the town of Tzfat or Safed in the north of Israel. Caro wrote the Shulchan Aruch to make the law clear and accessible to every Jew. It's written in a very concise, straightforward manner. The laws are simply listed without much reason or explanations given. The Shulchan Aruch is 4 volumes, and it's the last formal compilation of the Jewish law. It remains to this day the guide to all matters of Jewish law. There are a few of them actually, but the Shulchan Aruch is still used and accepted. Now, prior to the Shulchan Aruch, and this is very significant in terms of the scope of the work, Maimonides in the 12th century, again, this is in the 16th century, the Shulchan Aruch was written in the 16th century, but the Mishnah Torah by Maimonides was done in the 12th century prior to the Shulchan Aruch. And Maimonides did what the Shulchan Aruch did, but he did it first, and he did it better, according to many people. And the reason is that his was much simpler. Maimonides' earlier work along the same lines, called Mishnah Torah, was the first time such a work had been undertaken, and there are those that still follow his work as an abbreviated compilation. So what Maimonides ended up doing is he, again, the Talmud is all over the place. You have the discussion of the 613 laws, but they're not done in any particular order. You might find something about the laws of Shabbat in one place, and then clear over in another book entirely. There'll be another commentary on Shabbat. What Maimonides did is he had an encyclopedic knowledge of all of the Talmud. He took every law and compiled it in one place, so that now you didn't have to scour all over one book to find any particular law. He combined them so that all of the laws on Shabbat were in one place, all of the laws so it was all put together in an organized fashion. Now, the Shulchan Aruch did a similar kind of thing, but they included much more of the commentaries, and it isn't quite as simplistic or easy to follow as the Mishnah Torah. There are those that won't count Maimonides' work, and will count the Shulchan Aruch. But almost everyone will at least accept the Mishnah Torah as a basic compilation in putting it together. So these are the writings based on the Talmud. So the Mishnah, the Gemara, put together become the Talmud, and then you have the commentaries. You have then the compilations of the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. The next book, and it's not chronological that this is the next book or the next writing, but the next writing I want to talk about is the Midrash. The Midrash. The Midrash is a collection of stories, of folklore, of legends, and interpretations and commentary and homilies about the Bible. Midrashim were compiled over thousands of years, from at least as early as 500 before the Common Era until sometime in the mid-1500s, or maybe even later, of the Common Era. Again, all of these stories, some of them you might hear portions of in the Talmud, but again, all of them compiled here in a writing called the Midrash. So it's again, and Midrash, the word means from the drash, so it's from that allegorical idea of what is said in the Bible, in the Torah. So that's the Midrash. Very fascinating, but it kind of reads like folk stories, folk tales, but very interesting. Some very fascinating stories that you can find there. Then we also have the Hasidic movement. We'll talk about this as we come into the next sections, into the more mystical commentaries, the Baal Shem Tov, So chronologically, the Mishnah Torah in the 12th century, Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century, Baal Shem Tov is going to be in the 17th century, along with many other mystical and Kabbalistic works that will happen during that time. So again, looking at the timeline up here, you have in the 400s to 600s to 800s, the Geonim, another group of commentators, the Rishonim, another group of commentators, and the Acharonim, the last group of commentators happening in the 1600s to 1800s, involved in commentaries on the Talmud and on the writings and on the Midrash, and put together. So those are some of the writings mostly related to the oral law. As I mentioned, I would show you a page of the Talmud, and this is from the Art Scroll Talmud app. And so you can see it is color coded here to give you an idea of how the Talmud itself. This is a page, one page, from the thousands and thousands of pages in the Talmud. But this is how it's arranged. All the pages will be arranged pretty much the same way. So at the heart of it here, in the pink, is the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah alone. So again, you can see how much shorter the Mishnah is. Then right beneath the Mishnah is the Gemara, and these are the commentaries on what has been written in the Mishnah up to 500 of the Common Era. Then over here, again, very prominent, are the comments of Rashi, and these were written in the also in the 12th century, 11th and 12th century. And Rashi was from northern France. So his commentary are here. The unusual thing, if you could see this, I don't know if you can see it clearly enough, Rashi's script is very different than the script. It's still Hebrew, but he uses his own script, which is interesting to see. So you actually have to learn his script in order to read and translate Rashi. And then the next most prominent is over here on the left side, and that's the commentary of the Tosafits from France and Germany from the 12th to the 13th century. Those are the commentaries from there. And then the next major grouping on this page is the comments of Rabbi Nassim ben Yaakov, also from the 11th century, and that's going to be these commentaries here. Okay. And then you have smaller contributions on pages. Right down here, you can almost see it. The notes of Rabbi Akiva Eger from Prussia in the 18th and 19th century. We have anonymous commentaries all the way down here at the bottom. You have other notes that were taken on the side of the page. These notes can be cross-references to other pages in the Talmud. They can be cross-references to medieval codes of the Jewish law, and they can also be textual corrections or comments from the original proofs. All of that you would most likely find here in this margin. So again, not easy. If you're just studying the Mishnah, which is how you begin, it's a little easier. You've got much less that you're reading, and then you just pick up all of the commentaries as you expand your understanding of the Talmud. So now we get to really the final portion of the writings that we're going to be covering here in terms of mysticism. The American College Dictionary defines mysticism as the, quote, doctrine of an immediate spiritual intuition of truths believed to transcend ordinary understanding, or of a direct, intimate union of the soul with the divinity through contemplation and love. Mysticism hinges on the notion that God is immanent, inherently present, and dwelling within all creation. And included in the mystical teachings, we have the Sefer Yetzirah, and then which was written in the first century or before that. But the Zohar, which was written in the also the first century, but rewritten or rediscovered anyway later on. And again, we'll talk about all of that. And that's what constitutes the Kabbalah. There's many other works as well, but those are two of the major works that are involved in the Kabbalah. So the literary history of Kabbalah begins about 4,000 years ago with the Sefer Yetzirah taught by Abraham, and that's where it's believed to have come from. Then about 2,000 years ago, Shimon Bar Yochai composed the Zohar, but it wasn't formally written down until Moses de Leon in the 13th century of the Common Era. Gershom Scholem, who wrote of the Kabbalah, quote, "It has been one of the most powerful forces ever to affect the inner development of Judaism, both horizontally and in depth. Today, unquote. Today, there's an army of charlatans peddling some versions of Kabbalah as a New Age remedy for what ails you spiritually, and there's a cautionary tale for that. Again, there's truth involved there, but again, truth mixed with other things. A few rules of thumb should guide anyone wishing to study Jewish mysticism seriously. And this really goes back to what we talked about in terms of the Pardes, the way to study Torah. The first thing is, before you even begin to study mysticism, you really need to have a solid grounding in Torah, in Tanakh. That's your foundation point. Because the reason for that, the main reason, is that you're going to read things in the Zohar that are allegorical. They're not meant to be taken literally. But there's a deeper meaning that you have to search for. So if there's something in the Zohar, and this is why the foundation is important, if there's something in the Zohar that seems to contradict the Torah, that seems to say that God has a body, that seems to say that, one thing or another that would be heresy in mainstream Judaism, then you have to recognize that that's exactly what's happening, that it is not true. It is an allegory. It's a way of going deeper into the truth. But if you don't have that initial grounding, that foundational understanding of what's in the Torah, of what the foundational truths of Judaism are, then you're going to be led astray. You're going to either become, as Acher did, a heretic, or it'll drive you crazy trying to understand how the Zohar can talk about the things that they talk about. So it reads in modern kind of terminology. It's like reading a science fiction book or a fantasy book. You know that there's truths in there. There's science in the fiction, but that there's supporting that science. There are other elements that help you to understand it that are less than factual, okay, to put it that way. The other thing that's required to study mysticism really is a lifetime commitment. It's not something you can pick up a book, like even the Zohar, which is several volumes long, and read it and say, okay, I got it now. Even if you have an encyclopedic mind, you don't have it. You have what's here, but you don't have what's beyond here. So that lifetime commitment, there are things the first time you study Zohar, you're gonna see things, and then the second time you study Zohar, you're gonna see other things, and then the third time you study Zohar, you're going to see the things you thought you saw before and realize you didn't really see them. But it's that you're not going to get that if you look at studying the Zohar as a one and done kind of a situation. The third thing that is just vital. The Zohar itself was written in Aramaic, but when I say a knowledge of Hebrew, that includes Aramaic, but in Aramaic is very much like the Hebrew. The reason that's important, again, is that the use of gematria, numerology, is very prominent. The use of understanding the structure of letters. There's so many things that not knowing Hebrew, trying to read this in translation, is just not going to work. certainly not as well as it needs to. That's part of the lifetime commitment. Yeah, again, for rabbis who have been trained from the time they're 3 years old to learn Hebrew, that's one thing. If you're just coming into it now, it's really good. There's nothing wrong with reading it, but recognize that you're not getting a fraction out of it that you could if you had a knowledge of the original language. And again, by Hebrew, I recognize the Zohar is written in Aramaic. But the Kabbalah seeks to explain the relationship between the infinite God and a finite human mind. And it does this really by means of 10 steps or powers or emanations, and that's called the Sephirot, or the Tree of Life. And the relationship is between God and humankind. The Zohar here, the Zohar is the central work of Kabbalah. It's also the meaning of the word Zohar. It's called the Book of Splendor, a mystical interpretation of the Torah, rich with spiritual inspiration. The Zohar is attributed to Moses de Leon of Granada in Spain in the late 1200s. Generally accepted date is 1268, but as I mentioned earlier, it's actually believed that what he wrote down was, again, an oral understanding or oral teaching that actually came much earlier in the 2nd century from Shimon Bar Yochai. At any rate, the publication of the Zohar began the period of the Kabbalah, the mystical interpretations of the philosophies, the hidden meanings of Jewish life and teachings. This is admittedly a very brief discussion of a body of study that's become central to a deeper understanding of God's Word. It also involves the knowledge of Hebrew, as I said before, as the alphabet of creation, and all part of a larger class. I do teach a class on mystical Hebrew. Would highly recommend that to you if you get a chance. Eventually that will be uploaded here to Yeshiva B'nai Noach, but at this point I don't know if it's out there or not. But again, the idea is that there is a line of transmission that is a very clear line. Mysticism, mystical Judaism is not something that all of a sudden sprang up and from the fertile imagination of someone. We trace mysticism, mystical understanding, as far back as the school of Shem, the son of Noah, and the yeshiva that he taught through. We see the Shimon Bar Yochai, 2nd century, the Sefer Yetzirah, Abraham, the Sefer Yetzirah. We see Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century writing the Zohar. We see other schools of Kabbalah, Isaac Luria, the Lurianic school, the Gaon of Vilna, the Baal Shem Tov, Hasulam, so many other schools and commentaries that make this study of mysticism so rich and so wonderful and so powerful. But again, with problems if you're not founded in traditional understanding and recognizing that much of what you're reading here is very deep, very mystical, very allegorical, and must be read in that context. So now let's move from there to the prayer book, which is really a beautiful combination of so many things. The prayer book itself, which is called the Siddur, which simply means the order, again, like Seder for the Passover meal. It has a system. It's a systematic outline of prayer. And just like all of the writings that we looked at previously, the Siddur itself is a compilation. It's a compilation of the mystical. It's a compilation of the Torah. It's a compilation of the Tanakh. It's a compilation of rabbinic commentary. All of that connected together into something that is done 3 times a day, 7 days a week, as far as the traditions of Judaism and Torah observant Jews are concerned. So it was first outlined, the idea of the Siddur was first outlined by Rab Amram ben Sheshna. He was Gaon in the Academy of Surah in Babylonia in the year 870 of the Common Era. So less than a century later, the great Rabbi Saadia Gaon compiled a more complete, more logical Siddur, which to this day still serves as the basic format for Jewish prayer. But the original designation of the three prayers, morning, afternoon, and evening, and the basic outline of those prayers was established by Ezra further back around 500 before the Common Era. Throughout the ages, the Siddur has been the formal vehicle by which a Jew could communicate with God. The three main prayers each day required of Torah observant men: Shachrit in the morning, Mincha in the afternoon, and Ma'ariv in the evening. The time is fixed with relation to the sun and stars, allowing a window of time, usually about 5 hours, within which the prayers can be completed. The prayer service is structured around at least 3 and up to 5 main groups of prayers, with Shacharit being the richest structure. The 5 portions of prayer are praise and thanksgiving, and the or warm-up section. This is followed by the 2 central prayers in Jewish life, the Shema and the Amidah. So we see that here in terms of the warm-up, which includes the morning blessings, the Psalms, and Pasuk de Zimra, all of that as part of the preparation, the warm-up. Okay, and then that's followed by the Shema, followed by the Amidah. These are considered the 2 central prayers in Judaism. And the Amidah is also called Shemona Esrei, which means the 18 prayers, 18 benedictions, 18 blessings. There are actually 19. We're not going to go into that too much, but it's still called the Shemona Esrei, the 18. Okay, so those are the central portions. Now, in synagogues, on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbat, there is an added Torah service. So this is only added on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbat. And there are reasons why those days are selected. And the basic idea is that you shouldn't go more than 2-3 days without reading Torah or studying Torah. So to enable you to make sure that everyone is on the same page, if you will, that's done in the synagogue on those days. And also, not only the Torah is read, but there's a section called the Haftorah, in which the prophets are also read, not completely, but a great deal of the portion of the prophets are read at the same time. You do throughout the year read the entire Torah every year in synagogue. So finally, then we have the closing section, and that's more praise and thanksgiving, as well as our prayers for those who have died, called Kaddish, part of the concluding prayers. Some prayers do require a minyan of 10 Jewish men to pray, and some must be prayed in the synagogue. So all of this is much richer if you're part of a community. It doesn't mean it can't happen, that you can't do this on your own. And unfortunately, many of us are not in a place where we have a good community or a community where we can pray with a minyan. That doesn't mean we should stop praying, but it's not as rich, it's not as powerful as with praying with a minyan. One of the reasons that I've heard that I like in terms of the importance of a minyan is that very often you come to prayer in various stages of spirituality. Some days you're right at the top, and other days you're down at the bottom. With a minyan, when God hears the prayers of all 10 or more of you, he only hears the ones that are the ones that are at the top carry everyone else. So if you're not there on one day but someone else is, that's okay. Your prayers are still lifted. I like the idea of that in the sense that that's part of community. That's what community is for, lifting everyone up. And very often, and I've personally discovered this, you go in feeling very tired or very non-spiritual, but by the time you leave, the energy, the power, the dynamic of the minyan lifts you completely up, and you leave in a much better place. And that wouldn't necessarily happen if you're at home. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but doesn't necessarily happen in the same way. So again, this is the Siddur, one structure of it. We'll take a look at one other here. Here's a more detailed look as we take, this is an abbreviated sample of the Siddur contents. So the purple is going to be the warm-up, and some of this is done at home rather than at the synagogue, even if you're going to the synagogue to pray. These, like the morning blessings, the Torah blessings, the Pesuk to Zimre, it can be done in either place. Some of these can be done at home, or you can actually you can go to the synagogue early and do them there. But the synagogue service itself isn't going to start until somewhere in Pesuk to Zimre, depending on what's happening at the synagogue. So purple is the warm up, and the green then are the two central prayers, the Shema and the Amidah. The orange is the Torah service, again on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbat. The tan is the is the concluding prayers. You can also see the shorter Mincha prayer, which only consists of the Amidah, or the Shemona Esrei, and then a few concluding prayers. Okay? And it might also, depending on the day and the festivals, might also include the confessions, Tachanun, and we see that also in the conclusion of Shacharit. There are many other portions of that you can pray. Many people will pray the 13 principles of faith. Many people will read and meditate on the 10 remembrances, otherwise known as the 10 commandments. Many will pray or meditate on the chapter on the manna, and just a rediscussion or setting up of the Torah chapters on the manna, giving of the manna. And that's another thing to mention here. The whole point of the prayer service, not the whole point, but one of the things to understand about why the prayer service is structured the way it is, somewhere here in the morning blessings and the Torah blessings, just before the Pesuk to Zimri, there are also sections that deal with the laws of incense, the laws of sacrifice, because the rabbis taught after the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era, the rabbis taught that prayer, as many of the prophets spoke of, prayer can take the place of the sacrifices that were missing. So in order to recognize that, the rabbis had instituted in the prayer book itself, in the prayer service, a study of the laws that were related to the temple, so that by reading those laws, it's as if you have fulfilled the temple sacrifice. So in that sense, according to the rabbis, the temple sacrifices have never stopped. They have continued on, but they've been replaced with the idea of prayer. Again, it is not a statement, which I know that many will want to take. It is not a statement that the temple is no longer needed. It is needed, but we recognize that it is God that will bring it back, not us. So until that happens, then this is what stands in its place, if you will. Okay, so again, getting back here, we have the Mincha prayer, very very short prayer in the afternoon, and then the evening prayer includes both the Shema and the Amidah. There's not a lot of warm up, a little bit before it, and there's not a large conclusion afterwards. So again, these two services are much shorter. Shacharit can take usually about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how much time is spent. Certainly when there's a Torah portion read, and perhaps even on Shabbat, This would take 2 to 2.5 hours, maybe even longer, because there's also the rabbi's drash, his sermon that he would give in the process of doing that. But during the week, the Shacharit service, generally about an hour. It can be done faster, but hour is about the right amount of time, if you will. Mincha service, 15 to 20 minutes. The Arvit, the evening service, is about a half hour. It's about 30 minutes, give or take. So that's the way that is set up. For men, the tzitzit, the wearing of the prayer shawl, and the tefillin are also a part of the home prayers and part of the synagogue prayers, except on Shabbat, you don't wear tefillin. You do wear the tzitzit. Okay, so the shorter Mincha, Mariv, or Arvit services, and the tefillin are generally, you can put them on in the synagogue. Again, on Shabbat, you're not supposed to carry, so you're either wearing them or they're there at the synagogue, and you put them on to do that. So that's a look at the Siddur, the prayer service. For Noachides, there is not all of the prayers are applicable. For Noachides, there is. I don't know if there's anything official. I think Nativ, perhaps a few other places, nativ.org. You can check it out there. I believe have a prayer Siddur for Noachides. Essentially, what you're doing is eliminating those portions that are specifically for Israel. But many of the Psalms, many other of the prayers, certainly many portions of the major prayers you're going to find in the Noachide Siddur as well. Okay. A lot of information here, almost 2 hours worth. As I mentioned earlier on, this is a video, so I'm not too worried about the time frame, because you can stop it and start it as you want to. But again, very important to recognize that we are called a people of the book, and these are the books that we are the people of. And there, of course, there are thousands and thousands of books on commentaries, on many other subjects, on Judaism, how to practice it, on the festivals, all of those. Some of the books I showed you here at the beginning as well. So be sure, and if you need to or want to learn more, there are ways to do it. Of course, online, YouTube videos, many places that you can find out information. We've just touched on a very, very, very surface level this. So next presentation, we'll be dealing with the life cycles in Judaism, from birth to death. And we'll be looking at some of the things that Judaism requires, some of the things that are Jewish for those who are observing. Okay, so that'll be our next presentation. Thank you for sharing your time with me here. For Yeshiva B'nai Noach, I'm Tom Averna. Shalom.